Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Brown People Problems, a podcast where we chat about experiences and circumstances that are unique to Brown folks. Now, today's episode is an extension of last week's episode on boundaries. So if you haven't listened to that episode, I will encourage you to pause this and go listen to that one, where we chatted about 5 signs that you need boundaries in your life. So a number of you were asking me, well, what is a boundary violation? So, we know that there's different signs where you know that your boundaries are being crossed, but a number of folks continue to maintain some confusion around what exactly is a boundary violation. So in today's episode, we're going to be talking about 3 common boundary violations that I commonly find to be present in Brown families and Brown households. Now, as always, there is an exception. There always are exceptions and outliers to what we're talking about. So if you personally find that things are quite healthy in your family, do not take what we talk about today to just mean to be like the universal truth. There's a lot of variation, a lot of variability in our cultural groups, and this is more of a general trend that we're talking about today. All right, now of course there can be many ways your boundaries can be violated in friendships, at work, but I want to focus on just family relationships, familial relationships, parent-child relationships, sibling relationships, partner relationships, and how boundaries can be violated in those relationships. And we're going to be talking about 3 main common boundary violations. First one is enmeshment. Second is codependency. And third is trauma bonding. So if you'll recall my metaphor from last time around boundaries, where you imagine you have a whole bunch of houses on a street and none of them have any a boundary or a fence distinguishing one backyard from another. So it's just an open patch of grass and everybody treats it like their own backyard. That's sort of akin to an enmeshed boundary, an enmeshment, where there's no clear distinction between what is mine, what is yours, and what is me and what is you, and there's no individuality here whatsoever. So like what it sounds, enmeshment or enmeshed boundaries is when individual boundaries don't exist and there's just this like combination and this like enmeshment of boundaries within a family. Now, in relationships with enmeshed boundaries, like I said, individualization and boundaries are just not accepted. There's this expectation that each person is going to be similar to one another in the family. So they may have like similar needs or values and they should act the same and want the same things. There's that type of an expectation. There can often also be a lack of emotional separation. And what I mean by that is there can be this emotional type of codependency, which we'll talk about in a bit as well, but really this like emotional codependency on maybe between like the parent and the child, or between siblings. So an example of this could look like, say a mom in the family really relying on her daughters or her sons for that emotional validation and acknowledgement and emotional love and respect that she's not getting in her relationship with her husband. There can also be intrusive demands for attention in these relationships. I also see a lot of guilt tripping, right? So if you don't do this, if you don't study what I want you to study, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. Or if, you don't do as we say, then I'm going to withdraw, love, or I'm going to be hurt. And really this type of intrusive demands for love and attention. What usually happens in families where there is a lot of enmeshment is family members are not able to develop a strong and independent sense of self. So they're not really able to distinguish between what is my need versus what is my family's need versus what is my parents' need and wants, and everything just feels like a mishmash. How this manifests is it can look like, say, oversharing with strangers, right? Which is something that we talked about last time, but oversharing with others, not knowing someone's boundary and what they're kind of ready to hear or not hear. We often see this in oversharing in mother-daughter relationships where say brown mothers who have had their own share of trauma and bad experiences, whether in their marriages or in their homes or with their in-laws, they start to overshare a lot of this with their adult daughters. And that can often create this burden on now the child to reverse parent and to try and meet the emotional needs of the parent. Enmeshment can also look like rejecting the other person if they attempt to set boundaries or if they want different things. So, what comes to mind for me here is, in homes where a child, so like a son or a daughter, they want to marry someone outside the culture, right? Or they want to marry someone outside the religion. And that can be met with rejection of them and their needs and their values, right? So there can be a lot of conflict that comes as a result of that. But I often, think about folks who want to marry outside their faith or who are dating someone who's not from the same cultural group, who may be from like the dominant cultural group. For parents, for a lot of parents, a lot of brown parents, that can feel like a rejection of themselves, right? So this is a sign of enmeshed boundaries where they expect their values and needs and wants to be like exactly what their kids want and need and should have. And when now a child wants something different, the parents can outright just reject that nope, this is never going to happen. And that can lead to like a lot of guilt tripping too, right? Something that's very common with a lot of children of immigrants is this narrative that, we sacrificed so much for you, we came here for you. And while there's certainly like a lot of truth and compassion in that, that can be used to manipulate behavior. So whenever another person in the family tries to form an individual identity, it's rejected. I often also see this in families where two siblings are really quite different from one another, like their personalities are really different from one another. We can see parents really just express this like disdain that, one child likes to travel and the other one doesn't travel at all. And because they're different people, but there can be this expectation in these families that the kids are going to be exactly the same, that they're not going to have their own individual identity. And when there is that kind of expectation, family members are given very little personal space, physically or emotionally. So maybe there isn't so much like identity development that happens, right? There's no sense of individuality, sense of who you are, that doesn't get developed. So that was enmeshment. Next up, we have codependency. And if you're wondering, well, Nikita, like I've noticed these in my families and how do I set boundaries? Definitely stay tuned for that because in a few minutes we'll be chatting about some of that as well. But the second major boundary violation that I see in brown families happen is codependency. Now, there's a lot of talk around this term, codependency, and there is a lot of misinformation out there as well. So let's clarify this once and for all. But codependency, it's not so people often think that if I want something from others, if I want love and validation from others once in a while, then I'm codependent. That is not what codependency is. Codependency, by definition, is really feeling like we have to save people from consequences of their bad actions and saving them and wanting to save them from unpleasant experiences. So we think that we're protecting these people that we love, but really what we're doing is we're enabling their behavior, either through acting a certain way or just either through inaction. For example, we see an adult child in a brown family who is perhaps, say let's struggling with substance use. And it's like bordering addiction and substance dependency. the parents can, so step in and really try to rescue their child. If the child gets a DUI, for example, they'll step in and rescue them, or they will make allowance for this child's behavior, or they will, express that they're unhappy that their child is, like drinking or engaging in substances. But they also might continue to support that behavior by giving them money. So if this person has spent all their money on their substances, giving them money to buy more substances. But really, in this type of a scenario, people become completely entangled emotionally with the feelings and outcomes of other family members, right? So I'm thinking about, for example, an adult child in a brown family, maybe, just hopping from, say, like job to job to job, like every couple months, and really trying to, say, like change their career every couple months. And the parents can really, or other people in the family can really enable that by not creating a boundary, not helping that person reflect on what's going on and seek help, but to really kind of condone that and say, yeah, it's okay, we'll support you no matter what you need, and making allowances for them. Now, this is where codependency can get tricky, because codependency is often well-meaning. I'm not a parent, but I can only imagine as a parent, when you see a child in pain or in trouble or in discomfort, you just want to do anything that you can to take that pain and adversity and discomfort away. And this is where it gets really tricky, because codependency is well-meaning, but it is also a slippery slope. And it is this epitome, really, of enmeshment that continues to perpetuate the behavior of the family member that is causing them grief. So maybe a less intense example of this could be, imagine a family member who is unable to do things on their own. So maybe with even like running the simplest errands, they need the help of the family or siblings, and it's a recurring pattern over a period of time. So it's not something that's temporary. It's whether they need to go to the bank, or whether they need to be dropped off somewhere, or they need help doing their finances. And it's just constantly they need things from others, and family members can enable this by overextending themselves instead of creating a boundary with that person. This can also look like doing things for other people all the time instead of helping them do things for themselves. I think about how parents, who will come in, or siblings who will come in and do their younger siblings' homework every time. So there's a difference, right, between helping someone do their homework and doing it for them. And that is, I think, a great explanation for codependency. The person who's enabling the behavior can really have a difficult time existing in that relationship without feeling this like need to be the rescuer. And again, they're not able to distinguish their own needs from the needs of others. Now, again, another thing that adds another like layer of complexity to this is that for the person who's enabling the behavior, who's supporting the behavior through action or inaction, for them, it's possible that their own needs were never met. So them meeting other person's need is a way of them regulating themselves. It's a way of them meeting their own needs. Because if I can meet everybody else's needs, perhaps I will have that sense of like calm and stability and regulation that I've always been looking for. And for the person who is being enabled, who is receiving this, it's harmful for them too, because now they will never develop the capacity to meet their own needs. And the third major boundary violation that I have noticed in brown families is trauma bonding. Now, another insta-hyped term that we're seeing everywhere, and again, there's a lot of misinformation around this, so let's clarify trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is a deep emotional attachment to someone who is causing you harm. Now, you are being manipulated by someone, and now you're being manipulated into believing that you deserve that ill treatment or that harm or that trauma. There's quite a bit of like psychology around this. Trauma bonding is really at the crux of domestic violence and abusive relationships and the cycle of abuse, but it's really maintained through this, what we call intermittent positive reinforcement. If you have seen some documentaries around why Instagram is so addicting or TikTok is so addicting, it's because anytime you see something that you like on your social media, your brain gets this like little rush of dopamine. You get this chemical reward that helps you feel good, so you continue to engage in the behavior, even though the dopamine rush, the good feelings, are very intermittent and they come randomly and sporadically. So it's something very similar happens in these relationships. A term that you may have seen online is called breadcrumbing, right? Where a person may be, really kind of like, say your partner may be like really aloof and really disengaged for some period of time, but here and there they'll throw in these breadcrumbs of appreciation, of random gifts of validation. And then that disappears again. But then you hold on to that breadcrumb as a hope that things could change. This can often show up in brown parent-child relationships as harsh treatment to kindness. So like cycling from treating their child really, really harshly to now just like tons of kindness. And this makes me think about how so many children are disciplined. Even if we're not talking about cases of abuse here, I think most of us listening have experienced criticism, right, from our parents. And this trauma bonding, that doesn't mean that everybody's trauma bonded to their parents. Let me just clarify that. But in an example of trauma bonding, this can really look like, say like you mess up on an exam and you don't get a good grade, and that follows a lot of like verbal abuse, just like lashing out, a lot of criticism, calling you names, telling you you're stupid, that you've really like wasted my time. I've immigrated to the country for you, and you're wasting my efforts, you're wasting your efforts. There's like a lot of negativity. And then also being able to justify that by saying, well, you failed your class, so that's why I have no choice but to be this way with you. So not taking accountability for their own actions. And then cycling through that with random acts of intense kindness. So that creates a lot of confusion in the relationship as well for the child, or for anybody who's on the receiving end of that. Another way this can show up is making excuses for another person's mistreatment of you. And the very first kind of thought that comes to mind for me when I think about that is girls are being told, typically that, oh, you were catcalled because look at what you were wearing. Or, you were mistreated or you were abused because you were at this time with this person, and so and so and so. That like victim blaming mentality. That can also fall in the realm of trauma bonding, which is just gaslighting. Now, those were the three most common boundary violations that I notice in brown families. So let's talk a little bit about what are some possible solutions, or what are some possible things that we can do about these. So what would boundary setting look like in these scenarios? Now, if you are in a relationship with enmeshed boundaries and you find yourself, say, like oversharing things, it can be helpful to reflect on before you share, can you ask the person if they have the bandwidth for this, right? Something very simple that we do in my home, my partner and I, is if, regardless of any time, but if there's something that we want to talk to the other person about that just feels like heavy or is really bothering us, or we've had a bad day at work and we come home, we don't just delve into what our day was like, and we just don't delve into this topic. What we do offer is the courtesy to each other to be able to ask, hey, I had a really crappy day. There's something on my mind and I really want to talk it out with you, but do you have the bandwidth for this right now? Do you have the time and space for this now? And giving the other person the opportunity to say, yes, sure, let's talk about it. And also to say no, that, you know what, I want to be there for you, but I don't have the bandwidth for this. So can we talk about this in another hour, right? Or can we talk about this in a couple hours? So that type of boundary setting can create that mutual like respect for one another, and also intention then for the conversation. If someone is feeling very enmeshed with another person in the family or in their partnership, It may also be helpful to reflect on, your own constant need for that person and your constant need for contact with that person. Now, with codependency, boundary setting can be interesting. If you find yourself always just being like roped into rescuing someone else, part of boundary setting is also just like reflecting within ourselves, is what is it within me that is prompting me to rescue this person again and again and again. So developing a bit of that self-awareness. And there's nothing wrong in offering to help, but as long as there is a conversation on, okay, I will be there for you through this right now, but what are you going to do next time this happens? What is your plan for the future should the same circumstance, same problem show up for you? A boundary can also look like sharing with the person how their behavior is impacting you. So, for example, a partner that is, I don't know, struggling with overworking, right? And they're constantly feeling overwhelmed and they don't have time for the relationship, they don't have time for the home, they don't have time for the children. A boundary can look like communicating to them that, hey, while I am happy to pick up the extra slack in the home, and again, being mindful of that because you also don't want to keep enabling that behavior of the other person. But a boundary setting can look like sharing how their lack of boundaries with their work is impacting you and your relationship. Finding ways to also support others without doing things for them. This can be, of course, really tricky depending on the type of position that we're in where codependency is manifesting. But if possible, exploring ways of how can I support this person without necessarily doing things for them all the time. And if we are in codependent relationships, it is so important to take care of ourselves because rescuing someone over and over again is exhausting and is absolutely depleting. So even just taking a step back to care for ourselves can be a form of a boundary. Now, boundaries with trauma bonding is really interesting because we don't want to convey that people trapped in a trauma bonded relationship are there because of their own inability to set boundaries, right? So abuse in an abusive relationship, whether it's a romantic relationship or a familial relationship, like this type of like manipulation and this type of breadcrumbing and then mistreating you, like this, it's very, very like complex. And so if you are in at that circumstance, it's not because of you or that you are unable to set boundaries. But a couple things to think about can be that when we see someone mistreating us, can we make a boundary right then and there and stop them and say, I don't like when you say that. Or to be able to say, when you say that, that makes me feel uncomfortable. Now, this is extremely tough in parent-child relationships, in partnerships where there is abuse, even if it's emotional abuse, verbal abuse. It's very, very difficult, and often it can just be harmful to create boundaries. So please, please, please do not take this as like general individualized advice. Of course, none of this ever is advice, but that's what makes trauma bonding so complex and so difficult because this is very nuanced. But some things that we can control is forming relationships with those that we trust and reevaluating the relationship once we start to see a pattern forming. Now, this is a lot more possible, say, in friendships where there's perhaps trauma bonding, or there is a romantic relationship where there's trauma bonding. This can obviously, like, you can reevaluate the relationship if it's a parent-child relationship. It's not always an option to cut off your parent, for example, or to cut off your sibling, but there can be an option for more boundaries in those relationships. If you would like to read more about this, I will have a lovely book resource linked in the show notes below. It's the same book that I had recommended in the last episode, which is Nedra Tawwab's Set Boundaries, Find Peace. She is a therapist from United States and she's incredible, and a lot of the content discussed in last episode and today's episode is a culmination of a lot of her work, a lot of my own learnings and experiences as well. Hopefully you enjoyed this mini series on boundary setting. Again, boundaries is a very complex topic. It's very nuanced. It takes a long time to be able to form boundaries, and we should not feel bad if we are not born with this ability to do so, right? So please be kind to yourselves and to those around you as you navigate and engage in these conversations and these topics. And I will see you for next week's episode. Stay tuned for our disclaimer. Thank you for joining me, everyone. The guest and the host of Brown People Problems do not offer individualized therapeutic or medical advice, and our conversations should not be interpreted as such. This podcast is not a replacement for therapy. This podcast exists for educational purposes only. Please consider your circumstances and engage with the content mindfully.